Everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm your host Ian, and today we're diving into a pivotal chapter in Canadian economic history. The double dip crisis of the 1980s and the 1990s. These back-to-back recessions shaped our economy in a very profound way, influencing everything from jobs to government policy, and yes, even real estate and the market idea with every single day. First, let's set the stage with the 1981 and 1982 recession. This one hit hard and fast, lasting about 17 months. It was largely triggered by the 1979 oil shock, the second big energy crisis of the decade when global oil prices skyrocketed due to turmoil in the Middle East. That fueled rampant inflation across North America. In Canada, the Bank of Canada responded aggressively by jacking up interest rates. We're talking prime rates soaring over 20% at their peak in 1981. Imagine trying to buy a house or run a business with borrowing costs that high. It was brutal. The result? Real GDP shrank by about 5% over the period, with an annual drop of around 3.2% in 1982 alone. Unemployment surged from around 7.6% in 1981 to a peak of 12% by 1983. Leaving over 1 million Canadians out of work. This meant factory shutdowns, especially in manufacturing heavy provinces like Ontario and Quebec, and a real squeeze on household budgets as inflations ate into their wages. Now, fast forward less than a decade to the 1990 to the 1992 recession, often dubbed the Great Canadian Slump. This one dragged out a lot longer, about 2 full years from April 1990 to April 1992, and felt even more grinding because recovery was so sluggish. Causes here were a mix. Again, high interest rates from the Bank of Canada, this time to tame inflation, that had crept back up in the late 80s. Add in the introduction of the GST in 1991, which hiked consumer prices by 7%, and a slump in manufacturing due to global competition, the new Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, shaking things up. GDP took a massive hit too, dropping about 2.1% annually in 1991, with a cumulative decline over the recession. Unemployment climbed from 7.2% in late 1989 to a peak of 12.1% by November 1992. And it stayed high for years afterwards. Think jobless recovery, where the economy grows, but jobs just don't come back. Provinces like Ontario got hammered, losing hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs that never fully returned. Comparing these two slumps, side by side, there are some striking similarities and some very big differences. Both saw unemployment peak at around 12%, showing how vulnerable our labor market was during these shocks. GDP drops were severe in both, but the 1981 to 82 one had a sharper annual contraction in 82 at minus 3.2%, while the 91's was minus 2.1%. Though the 90s slump went worse because it lingered, with the unemployment falling through 1992 and beyond. The 80s recession was more of a quick punch from external shocks like oil, while the 90s one had homegrown elements like fiscal tightening and structural shifts in the industry. Interestingly, both led to major policy rethinking. After the 80s, we saw efforts to diversify energy sources, and post-90s, the federal government slashed deficits, setting the stage for the surpluses of the late 90s. But how did Canada fare compared to the rest of the world? Let's zoom out for a minute. The early 80s recession was a global affair. The US went through a double dip too, a short one in the 1980s and a deeper 1981 to 82 slump, with a GDP falling about 2.7% in 1982 and unemployment hitting 10.8%. Europe wasn't spared either. Countries like the UK and Germany saw similar inflation-fighting rate hikes, leading to recessions with GDP drops around 2 to 3% and rising joblessness. Canada actually suffered a bit more than the US when it comes to terms of things like GDP decline. 5% cumulative versus 3% there. But our unemployment spiked higher, reflecting our reliance on resource exports hit by the oil volatility. Globally, developing economies like Latin America and Africa got crushed even harder, with debt crises amplifying the pain. The early 90s was also international, triggered by factors like the Gulf War oil spike the US savings and loan crisis, and the end of Cold War adjustments. The US recession was milder and shorter, 1990 to 1991, with GDP down about 1.4% and unemployment peaking at 7.8%. But Canada's was deeper and longer. Our GDP drop was more pronounced, and unemployment rose to over that 12% mark, while the US recovered faster. Europe kind of varied. The UK had a sharp downturn with house prices crashing, similar to the US, and unemployment hitting 10.7%, while Germany boomed post reunification but then slumped. Japan entered its lost decade with asset bubbles bursting. Overall, Canada's slump stood out for its severity among developed nations. We lost more jobs proportionally, and recovery took longer due to our tight monetary policy and export dependencies. In fact, some economists point to this as a cautionary tale of overzealous inflation fighting. Now, we can't ignore how these recessions rippled into housing. The 80s high rates, over 20%, made mortgages unaffordable, stalling home sales and causing prices to dip in many areas, though the real crash came later. By the late 80s, speculation had built a bubble, and the 90s recession popped it. From 1989 to 1996, average home prices in the GTA plunged 34% in normal terms, and even more adjusted for inflation, up to 38% in Ontario overall. Commercial real estate boomed in the 80s, with permits surging eightfold, only to bust in the 90s as vacancies soared and values tanked. Unemployment fears kept buyers on the sidelines. Foreclosures rose, and it took years for the market to bottom out. Wrapping this all up, these double dip crises taught Canada tough lessons. The dangers of oil dependency, the cost of high rates, and the need for fiscal discipline. They paved the way for the stable growth of the 2000s, but also left scars like regional inequalities and more precarious job market. When it comes to real estate, we are constantly reminded that booms can turn to busts when rates spike or jobs vanish. Something to ponder in our current high rate environment. Now, if this sparked your interest in Canadian economics or how it ties to buying a home, drop a comment below. Like and subscribe for more deep dives, and thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one.